again from Toward a More Jewish Jesus, the podcast of interfaithfulness. And here at the More Jewish Jesus, we like to say that everything gets better when people get together around a more Jewish Jesus. We promote something which we call the three-stranded cord here at Interfaithfulness, especially through our home groups, which we call Discovery Chavarot, Haba'er Discovery Chavarot. And sometime I'll explain what Haba'er means to you again, but let's move on. That three-stranded cord is three things we think that need to work synergistically in combination with each other in order to be spiritually strong. And that is for Jews and intermarrieds to go deeper into Jewish life, deeper into faith understanding in a more Jewish Jesus, and deeper into relationship with God, deeper into Jewish life, deeper into the more Jewish Jesus, deeper into relationship with God. And today I want to look especially at that third strand of the three-stranded cord, going deeper into relationship with God. This brings us to something which used to be called testimonies. It's not a term you hear very much now, but it's a phenomenon that is still around, and that is how people go about telling the story of how they came to their own spiritual commitments. Now, the model of testimonies that existed for many years, and you can still find amongst Jewish people who believe in Yeshua, is this model, a model which I do not happen to be crazy about. But here's the standard model. The standard model says this is the outline. I was raised in a Jewish home, and my grandfather was very religious. And I went to synagogue a bit when I was a kid until I was bar mitzvahed, or in a woman's case, bat mitzvahed. But I never got anything out of it. Then I went away to college, and I got involved in this, I got involved in that, and then they described some kind of a problem of some sort. And then I met so-and-so who introduced me to the New Testament, and I came to believe in Jesus, and now I feel more Jewish than ever. That's the standard outline. Well, there's a couple of things wrong with this outline from my point of view. First of all, being Jewish is not a feeling. You might feel more Jewish than ever, but it's like me saying that I really love Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin, and I feel so black today. It doesn't change anything. Being Jewish is not a feeling. And the other thing about it is that this kind of a model is predicated on the fact that somehow Judaism failed you. You know, I grew up in a Jewish home, and my grandfather was very religious. I went to synagogue, I got bar mitzvah, but I never got much out of it. So you end up postulating your faith in Yeshua on the idea that somehow Judaism failed you. Maybe the reason you didn't get much out of your Judaism is that your family was underinvested in it. There could be 1,000 different reasons. But for me, it's offensive to predicate the credibility of Yeshua on the alleged failure of Judaism. I don't live there, I don't go there, I don't recommend it. But I'd like to give you an alternative model, which I call the slice of life with God model. And this is what I recommend to people when they contemplate how are they going to share their Yeshua faith with close friends. Let me define the model, and here I'll have to read to you. Just pardon me for one paragraph of reading. The slice of life with God model is a 7-component storytelling approach whereby Yeshua believers tell a story about their own experience so that others will think that just maybe the storyteller has encountered God in a manner worth investigating further. I want to talk about this just maybe. In the old model, which is still very prevalent, The goal is to get the person who's listening to sign on the dotted line, to get them to agree with your faith, and for that, get them to buy in. I think that's a mistake. I think it results in very sales-oriented approaches. It results very often in a kind of manipulation. It results in undue pressure. Doesn't work. I don't think it's good. As a matter of fact, people will never get to yes unless they first go through maybe. And I would suggest that our goal in talking to people about our Yeshua faith is to get them to maybe, to get them to say, maybe Stuart, maybe Sean, maybe Rachel, maybe Linda, maybe you have encountered God in a way that I need to look into further. So you need to get people to maybe. Let me tell you a story. Years ago, I knew a man named Rick. Rick and Polly lived in the Seattle area. Rick was a veterinary cardiologist, believe it or not, a man of science, a man from a kind of a nondescript waspish background who didn't have any religious faith. His wife, his Jewish wife Polly, came to believe in Yeshua in a rather remarkable way, and Rick was furious. It was so unscientific. It complicated their marriage. He wanted no part of it. But he told me this story. He said one day he was driving down the highway or these roads in Kent, Washington, or Everett, or Linwood. They lived in that area. And he's driving, and he says it's as though a window shade opened up in his windshield, and this question entered into his mind. What if it's true? That question had never been a real question to him. It had always been clearly, this is stupid, this is nonsense. I don't even know if I want to remain married to Polly. But then that question pierced his heart. What if it's true? And that question became the crack where the light got in. Because until he was willing to consider, well, maybe it's true, maybe it is, what if it is? Until he got to maybe, he never would have gotten to yes. And he did get to yes. And he had a radiant faith, and he was a great guy. I really enjoyed him. So, similarly with you and me, with all of us, when we talk to our friends about our faith, and when we talk about this component, remember the three components? Deeper into Jewish life, deeper into Yeshua faith, deeper into relationship with God. When we talk about relationship with God, we need to talk about getting people to a maybe. You know, in the Bible, you read in Jeremiah chapter 10. Jeremiah chapter 10 talks about God as being the living, the true and living God. The true and living God in Jeremiah chapter 10. When you go to the letters in the New Testament in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, Paul refers to the living and true God. So you have true and living, living and true. What's the difference? The difference is in the order. 150 years ago, if you could show somebody that what you believed was true, or that there was reason to believe it was true, they felt they had to deal with it. Nowadays, it doesn't work that way. Somebody will say, it's true for you, I don't need it. That's the end of the discussion. Truth is no longer the deal breaker. But that's the true and living God. That kind of argumentation doesn't work with most people, most postmoderns. But the living and true God, if you can show your friend that just maybe you have encountered the living God in a way they have not, then you may have a conversation. Then you may have opportunity to share more. Then they might say, I want to know more about that. I got to think about that. Because people are much more open and curious about encountering spiritual reality in a living way than they are in any of our cockamamie arguments about truth. they're not interested. So let's get back to the slice of life with God model. How do you tell people such stories? Well, these 7 components I'm going to give you are not like ingredients that you have to do in this order and you have to include them all. These are just aspects of what it means to tell a good story about anything. We're talking now about good stories about your spiritual experience. The first thing prior to that is just remember we're going to try to find a vignette, a little story in our life that gives our listener an opportunity to reasonably think maybe this person has encountered God in a living way. So you've got to think, are there stories in my life of when I've had spiritual encounters or something of that sort that other people might say, that's really interesting. You got to find that story. So let's go on. The first thing you do when you're going to tell one of these stories is, number one, assessment. You need to assess the person you're talking to. If you always tell your story about coming to Yeshua faith the same way, no good, because people are different. The Apostle Paul, you read his sermons, they're not all the same. He talked to the people in Athens different than he talked to the people in Jerusalem. They were different kinds of people. And when we tell our story, if we're telling the same story the same way every time, there's something wrong. You've got to assess who you're talking to. If you're talking to a friend of yours who, above all, is a parent par excellence, a mother utterly devoted to her children, always pulls out her wallet or her cell phone and shows you 14 pictures of her kids, then you may want to talk about experience with God where you encountered God's fatherliness, you encountered God's relatedness in some way. So my point is, you got to assess who you're talking to. Secondly, you need passion. You got to tell a story that matters to you. If it doesn't really matter to you, it's not going to really matter to them. There's got to be some passion. It's very easy to communicate about things that you're passionate about. So you got to find a story that is an important story in your life. Passion. Assessment, number one. Passion, number two. Number three, every story has a protagonist, a person who leads us through the story. In your story, of course, you're the protagonist. You need to help people to identify with you. When people tell a story like this, pardon me, well, I used to be a child molester, and I'm a registered sex offender in 14 states. Who's going to want to identify with that kind of person? You can't tell the story in a way which makes people think, oh, I don't want anything to do with this person. You need to make yourself a person that you can relate to. Realize you're the protagonist. You're the person who leads them into the story and towards its lessons. Number three, a good story has an antagonist. There's an obstacle or a negative situation that you were faced with that was the context for God's intervention. So you must do whatever you can do to make your listener feel the weight of the dilemma that you were in. Then take a movie like Shawshank Redemption. Shawshank Redemption. What's the antagonist in that story? The antagonist in that story is the prison itself and Andy Dufresne, who is unjustly imprisoned. That's the antagonist. That's the dilemma. That's what makes his escape from the prison such a celebration, because there's an antagonist. In your story, you should be able to identify some kind of a issue or a context or a dilemma that was problematic that your listener can identify with. So first, you need to assess, who am I talking to? You got to talk in their language. Number two, you're the protagonist. Try to be a person they can relate to. Don't tell the details about your life that they're going to say, oh, I don't want to hear that. Too much information. Don't do that. Number three, there's going to be an antagonist, an antagonistic situation that created a problem. Number five, this is kind of optional, but it's usual. There may be a turning point in the story when everything turned around in some way. Number 6, the hero of your story. Who is the hero of your story? In many of these stories, when people tell them, they make themselves the hero. You know, I know a guy named Avi Snyder, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. And he talks about Boris Badenov and Natasha from Bullwinkle. And he talks about Boris's testimony. I used to hate moose and squirrel. Now I love moose and squirrel. But that's all about Boris Badenov. When you tell the story, don't tell a story that says, you know, I used to be a worthless creep. I used to be a person whose life was going nowhere, and now I'm just wonderful. No, you're not. And people know you too well to be utterly impressed. You are not the hero of the story. Remember, the hero of the story is God, the God of Israel, blessed be He, as we've encountered Him, especially through our Yeshua faith. So that's number 6. A good story has a hero, and remember who the hero is. And number 7 is the element of transformation. Assuming that you're the protagonist of the story, how is life different now, if at all, because of the encounter you chronicled for your friend? Don't overstate it. There's more credibility in hesitancy than in hype. In other words, it's much more credible for you to say, I still don't have my act together entirely. I still have problems in this area, that area, the other area, but it's no longer the same as it was. That's much more credible than to say, man, I'm a totally different person. It's just great. That might be nice, but people say, yeah. One more comment. I want to talk about storytelling. Maybe you're sitting there watching, or in your car, or wherever you are listening to this, and you're saying, well, yeah, but storytelling, it's for children. No, it's not. In our Western culture, it's only a story is a way of saying it's not really real. But it's not that true in most of the world. It's not that true in the Bible. Yeshua, when he wanted to get big teachings across, in the Hasidic world, you go to a Hasidic meeting, you go to a Lubavitch meeting, you go to a Chabad meeting, when they want to teach you something about spiritual life, they always tell stories. Usually it's stories about the Rebbe, Zichrono Livracha. But stories in most of the world, and certainly in the Bible, are the way in which you get across truths that need to be remembered and never forgotten. Storytelling is serious business. So learn to tell your story in a way that is compelling. I'm going to close by telling you a story from my life. I'll give you an illustration of what I'm talking about, a slice of life with God. This is a very personal story. Let me tell you about it. Again, assessment, my audience, I'm assuming you're reasonably sympathetic. Passion, I'm passionate about this story. Protagonist, I'm a protagonist. Antagonist, I'll tell you what the situation is. That was the dilemma. The turning point, there's a turning point in this story. The hero is definitely the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there was a transformation. Let me tell you. When I came to Yeshua faith, I was going to Manhattan School of Music. I was a professional musician in New York City. I used to play music, what in New York is called club dates. In California, it's called casuals. Weddings, bar mitzvahs, playing in saloons, playing dance music. I did it very well. I enjoyed it, although I did not enjoy the fact that very often I had to play in climates that were kind of pathetic, where somebody's Aunt Yetta would dance around with a lampshade on her head, as I often say, or when people got a little bit too drunk, or came up and asked me to play a song that I've played 16 times this week, and I didn't have a lot of respect for it, but I made good money, and I did well. Well, then I did come to Yeshua faith through basically through a Bible study in my school cafeteria, but that's another story. I'm not telling you that story. I'm going to tell you about an antagonist that I encountered. I decided that the music business, I didn't feel comfortable in the music business. I'd always felt uncomfortable. I felt, like I said, climate was kind of pathetic. But I had no basis previously in which to reject it. I just thought I was oversensitive. But after I came to Yeshua faith, there was a great infusion of newness into my life, massive. And I've been living off of that infusion for 52 years. And I decided I'm going to get out of the music business. Well, the young woman who had invited me to that Bible study thought, whoa, Stuart, don't change your whole professional trajectory. You may be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You need to reconsider this. Don't make a rash decision. And she was right about that. So I knew a guy, his name was Paul. He was a PhD, a clarinetist, a band leader, and he invited me to be in his band at a club date at a hotel in the Catskills. I think it was a Shavuot weekend in the Catskills. The hotel was called the Melbourne. And I decided I would take that gig, that job, just to test the waters, to see how I felt about working in the music business again, whether I'd been oversensitive before. So I took the gig. And then one night, I was walking in what you might, or maybe it was the daytime. No, it was, I'm not sure what time of day it was. But I was walking in the quarters where the, quote, help slept. The waiters, the busboys, the band. And as I'm walking, a presence comes upon me. It was like a blanket. It wasn't warm, but there was a heaviness. The air sparkled. There was a personal blanket that came on me, in a sense. It was the presence of God in a way that I've never encountered God since. It was huge. The air literally sparkled. At that moment, I knew that behind that door that I was near, there was a group of people having a bull session about God. I didn't ask myself how I knew. I just knew. I knocked on the door, opened the door, and sure enough, sitting around the room, bellhops and waiters and busboys, people from the staff there were sitting around having a bull session about God. I told them the story of how I'd come to Yeshua faith. Then I excused myself. I closed the door, came out into the hallway, and the presence lifted. At that point, I knew that my career in life was not going to be the music business. It was going to be telling people about Yeshua faith and about relationship with God. Now, that's a true story. It's a story about which I feel passionate. The hero of the story is the living God, blessed be He. And it's had a profound effect on my life. I've had a number of experiences with God in my life in 52 years of being a Yeshua believer that are as real as that. Now, do you have dramatic experiences with God every day of the week? No. Even Abraham, you read about Abraham and God, where God promises he's going to have a son. It's 25 years later when he has another encounter with God, another dramatic encounter in Genesis 15. So let's not imagine that these kinds of things happen every day, but they are pivotal. And if you're listening to this story, what I'm inviting you to consider is just maybe, I've encountered the living God in a way that is worth looking into. If so, then we can talk some more. And that is the way a slice of life with God works. I'll say one more thing. Don't tell the story in a way that people can't identify. If somebody says, I came to believe, and then, pardon my expression, and then I spoke in tongues for 6 days. I could hardly speak English anymore. Well, that may be very nice for you, but most people are going to say, that's weird. You've got to tell the story in a way that doesn't make people disidentify. You're the protagonist. They have to identify with you. So it's not enough to tell the facts. You must tell people facts with which they can identify, which cause them to say, just maybe. And with that, I'll leave you for this week, just with one final reminder. Everything gets better when people get together around a more Jewish Jesus. Shalom.
You may support our work at Toward a More Jewish Jesus by sending your tax-deductible contributions to Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California, 91003, 6137. That's Interfaithfulness, P.O. Box 6137, Altadena, California, 91003-6137. Please make out your checks to Interfaithfulness. If you prefer donating on the web, please visit us at www.interfaithfulness.org and look for the Donate button in the lower right corner of the page. We invite you to follow us too at our Interfaithfulness Facebook page. Thanks for joining us today at Interfaithfulness, where everything changes for the better when we move toward a more Jewish Jesus.